the same studies that show that women care more about looks than they say also generally show that men care more about money and status than they say when dating.
Oh, interesting.
So
okay.
A man might say to you as a matchmaker, he might say, oh, I don't really care about, let's say he's a very successful man. He might say, oh, I don't really care about her career. She can do whatever. She could be a waitress, blah, 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 blah.
As long as she's passionate is the line I get.
Yeah, that kind of thing. But then he actually goes on a date with the waitress. And if he's, a CEO or something, or he's, a very high powered lawyer, he might be on that date thinking, fuck, I've got nothing to talk about.
The Life of Marin podcast is presented by MAAR Dating Club. MAAR Dating Club is a matchmaking service that represents New York City's most eligible singles. MAAR Dating Club works with professionals who don't have time or interest in dating apps, but still are genuinely ready to find love. We are a boutique firm that focuses on quality matches and guides and coaches our clients throughout the process. Use the link in the episode notes to book your introductory call today.
Welcome back to Life of Marin podcast. Today I have Macken Murphy. How are you today?
I'm good. I'm happy to be here.
Welcome. This is your third time with us, so third time's a charm. High level, do you want to introduce yourself? Who are you, just for the people who haven't listened to the previous episodes?
Yeah, so I'm an evolutionary social scientist. I study human behavior, and I'm specifically interested in human mating behavior. So you can think of me as someone who studies human romantic relationships the way that biologists study the mating behavior of other animals. So I'm very interested in evolutionary causes, thinking about ecology and environment and its impact on traits and things of that nature.
Okay, that's amazing. So you're studying for a PhD. When are you finishing your PhD? Because I feel like I've seen you 3 times now, and I'm like, are you done yet? What is happening?
I'm not even halfway through. No, PhDs take a long time.
How long?
Well, in the States, 5 to 7 years, but in Australia, you can get them done in 3 years, but I'm thinking it'll probably take me 4.
Okay.
So that would mean that I'm coming up on halfway.
Okay, amazing. And then what is your plan once you finish your PhD? Like, what are you working towards?
It's kind of ambiguous. I like my life the way it is right now, where I'm producing content and educating people about the field that I'm interested in, but then I'm also actually researching the subjects that I find interesting.
Yep.
And I feel like being a PhD student, a lot of people complain about it and put a bad filter on it, but it might actually be peak academia because you don't have nearly as much responsibility or pressure as like a PI or someone like that.
Okay.
But you still have tons of creative freedom. Like you can actually choose your own topics. Generally, it's not too much of an issue. If you want to do something, you kind of can. There's not much oversight as to, where you are or how you spend your time. So you have a lot of flexibility there.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm actively doing my PhD, but today I'm in New York with you and my PhD is in Australia. So it's a pretty good situation and I'm enjoying it very much.
I love that. And since we've spoken since the first time, you've amassed quite a following. So who is your following? I feel like you have a lot of super fans. People have been DMing me since I told them that you were coming on. So what is your kind of demographic that you serve?
Yeah, so the demographics that are really interested in my work, it's hard to know what causes this, but I know that it's mostly women, mostly under 30.
Oh, wow.
But it's hard to know because I first went viral on TikTok and TikTok itself is mostly women under 30. So I don't know like how to correct for that. I think women are generally more interested in psychology as a field. So if you look at the major distribution, women choose psychology more than men do.
Okay.
And then women are generally more interested in the, not romantic relationships themselves, but like the subject of romantic relationships from like an intellectual perspective.
Okay.
I feel like that's more something that women will, if you look at women's magazines and things like that.
Yeah.
So even though like if you scrolled through my TikTok, I feel like a lot of people would assume like, oh, this is like content for guys, like it's kind of guy coded or whatever.
Well, I was going to say, I thought most of your following was men.
Yeah, I feel like that's what you'd assume, like scrolling through, because it's got kind of, I don't want to say like a masculine energy, but it's like kind of like the way I've set it up is quite like stereotypically boyish, but yeah, women have been more interested in it.
Okay, so quickly before we get into the relationship stuff, I just, out of personal curiosity, I saw a video where you were talking about being vegan, and I had to ask you about it. So you're vegan.
Yeah.
When did you become vegan? Why did you become vegan?
Yeah, so I used to talk about it publicly more. I
Okay.
feel like I just don't really have the energy for it, and I also don't think that I feel like veganism is kind of a political thing, and I don't
Ooh,
think that
okay.
science and politics really go that well together as a combo. Like you want to be
I would
as
agree.
objective as possible when
Yeah.
you're trying to do science. I'm fine with people being political. I just don't think like if you're interested in facts, you should probably put that kind of thing to the side. Veganism, it's pretty tangential, but yeah, I've been vegan since 19. It's entirely, I don't think it's necessarily healthier. I've seen some evidence that it's better for the environment, but that's not really what I'm thinking about. Like the reason that I'm vegan is just because I really love animals and I don't want to eat them or pay other people to do violent things to them. I'd rather just not partake in that sort of thing if possible. You know, I mean, it's impossible to be like, you know, to have no impact on animals, but in as much as I can, I'd rather not if possible.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. I used to be vegetarian and then I kind of, you know,
Lapsed
after
vegetarian.
after
I mean,
8
most
years.
people do lapse. Yeah, after 8 years.
Yeah, so I was one for most of my 20s
Wow.
and then I finally was just in New York City and there was meat everywhere and so maybe in Australia it's easier. Did that impact your dating at all? Because I feel like, yes, there's like a little bit of a stereotype around people who are vegan.
Yeah.
And typically vegans date other vegans. Like, was that a factor for you at all?
Yeah, that's funny. I mean, my girlfriend's vegetarian, so I haven't, and we didn't, like, that didn't seem to, you know, impact anything when we met. But I know that I've seen some data, and I'm saying this as a vegan, I've seen some data that people generally would rather not, women especially, generally would rather not date vegans.
Okay.
And that's kind of understandable. Like you don't want, there are negative stereotypes associated with being vegan. But then also from just a purely pragmatic perspective, if you're not vegan and someone else has this really intense dietary and lifestyle restriction, well, that's going to impact your life as well. It's almost like dating someone who has a different sleep schedule from you. Right? Like there's gonna be like it's just a minor, it's just introducing a minor amount of chaos to have a mismatch there.
Yep.
And a lot of people aren't willing to do it. It never affected me. I never really noticed it. I think that in the abstract it probably would. Like I've never dated a big meat eater, but I think that like in the abstract on my end, I wouldn't find it like the most appealing thing to see someone like eating animals and things like that. Like that wouldn't be awesome.
Yep.
But it's not something that I've really thought about that much now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Well, thanks for going down the personal road. Okay, so a lot of your work revolves around dating preferences. So I do want to get into some of these questions. So are there any studies around who should kind of initiate a relationship? Like who should make the first move, a man or a woman? There's a lot of dating gurus out there that really harp on like the man should make the first move, the man should pursue. I myself believe a man should pursue early days. Do you have any research backing that?
Well, I'm not aware of any research that goes into who should approach more, as in like, I could imagine a study where you try to look whether relationships have better or worse outcomes based on who, you know, pursues.
Yeah.
I think one difficulty here though is that there's some research that indicates men and women both pursue at about equal rates, surprisingly.
Oh.
It's just that women pursue in a very different way.
That's
right?
interesting.
So there's kind of this very, very stereotypical, very memeable idea that it's like, oh, I stared at him for 3 seconds. How did he not get the hint, right?
Yes, I get what you're saying.
But there was an original research program where this group of scientists, and I'm speaking about this secondhand, this group of scientists was going out to bars and trying to tabulate whether men or women approached first. And initially, they were like, oh, men almost always make the first move. Women don't really approach men at the same rate.
Yeah.
This was way back in the day. But then they started looking for more subtle signs, like who looked at who first, right? Who smiled at who first, that kind of thing. And they noticed that women actually were doing a lot of those very subtle initiations. But I'm not aware of, you know, whether there's better outcomes for who's more hot on the trail, so to say. I would say that in the very stereotypical sense, it's typically the case that men are pursuing the interaction. But it can go both ways.
Yeah. No, and when I say pursue, I mean like they're messaging you first on a dating app. The man is, you know, arranging the date, stuff like that. not just, approaching
not just
at the
who
bar.
approaches who. I understand now. Yeah, so I'm not aware of that. I would say that one piece of evidence to consider is that women are more likely to initiate breakups than men.
Oh.
And more likely to initiate divorces than men.
Okay.
And so my intuition based on that is that if you're going based off relationship length, it's probably a better predictor what the woman feels than what the man feels, if that makes sense, since men don't initiate breakups as often.
Yep.
However, that speaks to relationship length. It doesn't necessarily speak to relationship quality. And I can imagine a world where, from a more qualitative perspective, maybe relationships function and feel better when the man is more interested in the woman. I could see it both ways.
Yeah, no, I agree. And yeah, I think it's more anecdotal, and I haven't heard any research where it was like the reason why the man should pursue is X, Y, and Z. It's just more like, matchmakers, generational women telling women this down the line.
And it may be a sex difference here where if you spoke to men, they'd be like, yes, no, the women should pursue, the woman should be interested in.
Totally.
If you spoke to women,
yeah.
they'd be like, the man should pursue, the man should be more interested. And I think we kind of all bring what we personally, what works best for us,
correct,
into our analysis of dating. Because my intuition, just thinking, I'm like, oh, it's my first gut reaction is, it's better if the woman's more interested. And then I'm like, well, I'm a man, so like, of course I have.
Correct. Yeah. No, that's funny. Yeah. Okay. So from the man's perspective, you want the woman to be more interested. From the woman's perspective, we want the men to be more interested.
Yeah. We all want our partners to be invested and love with us and things like that. Yeah.
Nope. That makes sense. Okay. And then is there, because a lot of people debate this as well, when to sleep together for the first time. What's your take from the research perspective? Like, when is the best time to have sex with someone that you're trying to date for the first time?
Ooh, I don't know. I don't know if I can give a fair research-based response.
Okay.
I mean, I've seen the various takes, and I think there's a reasonable case for both. This idea that, if you're serious about someone, then you might want to signal. In a long-term relationship, men and women are both, to some extent, interested in quote unquote chastity on average.
Okay.
Like men and women both don't really want to be with someone long-term who would sleep with just anybody.
Correct.
And so if you're, pushing to sleep with someone on the first date, there is a risk that you would signal like, hey, I would do this with anybody. However, I also feel like applying rules like that to dating is very difficult, because if you guys are both feeling the vibes and it's, an incredible first date, and I'm sure there are many couples who have gone on to have great relationships and actually are normally quite quote unquote chaste people who do that on the first date and then have a great time. So
yeah, no, I like when you said signaling chastity, because when you're thinking about your future husband, you don't want to feel like he's slept with half the town.
Exactly.
Or whatever.
Exactly. And so if you're a man and you're pushing for that on the first date, you might inadvertently, and if you're a woman as well, you might inadvertently signal like, hey, this is the sort of person I am. I'll sleep with anyone I've just met. And that's, for most people, I'm not saying everybody, but for most people, that's not a desirable quality.
Okay, that makes sense. I also saw that you were talking about a divorce recession. Is the divorce rate truly going down right now? And if so, why do you believe that is happening?
I don't know why it's happening, but I know that it's happening. So, and this is something, it's interesting because this is something that the anthropologist Helen Fisher actually predicted some time ago. She's unfortunately passed away quite recently. But she made the inference that, look, people are dating longer and marrying at a later age. And we know at the individual level that both of those things are associated with a lower risk of divorce.
Okay.
And so at the population level, and you can't always infer population trends from individual trends, but at the population level, it could stand to reason that the reason we're seeing divorce declining is because the people who do marry get married later and do so after more years of dating. Again, both of which are associated with positive outcomes.
Yeah.
Another possibility is that we see that the marriage rate is also declining concomitantly. And it's plausible that many of the people who would have gotten married and divorced back in the day now just don't get married at all.
Yeah.
And so that is part of what's lowering the divorce trends as well. It's one of the more surprising things. I think everyone has this loose impression that divorce is on the rise and divorce is, crazy common, but divorce has been consistently dropping. I believe we are the least divorced generation since the 1970s.
Yeah, that makes sense. And even from a matchmaking perspective, people talk about, their values aligning, lifestyles aligning, politics aligning, religion. Like, I think people are a lot more
careful.
Careful and thoughtful for like every step of the way. And they're willing to walk away if there's a deal breaker, and they're not rushing into something. And maybe that's because they perceive that there are more options out there because social media and the dating apps, who knows?
There were all these other reasons. I mean, we just talked about having sex on the first date. I mean, there was stigma against premarital sex as well.
Oh,
and
true.
You can say like, oh, that's maybe it was better that way, and in some ways, it's possible that it was, but in this way, it's definitely not.
Yeah.
Which is that some people got married because they were extremely sexually attracted to each other and wanted to have that experience. And anyone who's been in multiple relationships knows that, sexual compatibility, while it's very important, it's not everything. You can't build a marriage based off that.
No. Yeah.
And so being interested in each other physically and, putting the cart in front of the horse, that doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense. So that could have also been one of the reasons why divorce was higher then and lower now, is that stigma has basically completely gone away. And so people are more able to make marital selections based on important personal qualities.
Yeah, that makes complete sense to me. So as I already mentioned, I'm a matchmaker, so I deal with dating preferences all day, every day, and want to get into the research. My first question is, how do men and women's preferences differ when it comes to age and dating?
This is a very good question. It's a very topical question. It's a very controversial one, but it's only controversial on social media. In the actual dating research space, this is something that we've all had a pretty good grasp on for quite some time.
Okay.
So you'll see the meme online that all men prefer women in their early 20s or whatever. That's something that comes up a lot. And that's based on very limited data based on physical attractiveness. So from a physical attractiveness perspective, that does seem to be true. Most men are, throughout their lives, on average, most physically attracted to women in their early 20s.
Yeah.
But if you look at from a long-term dating and mating perspective, using revealed preferences, not what men say, what men actually do, you can look at, for example, men's dating app filters, right? Or men's stated preferences, what they say they want.
Yeah.
And what you'll see is that as men get older, they do prefer increasingly large downward age gaps. So they prefer increasingly younger women as they get older relative to themselves.
Yeah.
But that number quickly goes above the early 20s and eventually is over 30 and eventually over 35, right? So it may be true in the abstract that, men are most physically attracted to quite young women, but most men are not so shallow as to only select based on physical attractiveness. They also want someone who's emotionally compatible, someone who's intellectually compatible. And, most men over 35 are not going to be able to get along with a woman in their early 20s, right?
Yeah.
There's just going to be so little in common between them. And so most men of that age group, when they're using dating apps, when they're speaking to people, are not interested in someone quite that young, though they are interested in someone younger than them.
Okay.
Now, on the women's side, it's not so clear. It's not so clear that there is a peak age of, male attractiveness to women. There's no real equivalent to the, early 20s boost that women get, so to say.
Yeah.
But what we do see is that from a physical attractiveness perspective, men seem to be most attractive to women just purely physically in their, mid to late 20s, right?
Okay.
And then that declines not quite as quickly. It declines slower, but it declines from that point onwards. From an overall dating perspective, it seems that women throughout their lives prefer to date men who are 2 to 4 years older than themselves. And this is, around the world, this is quite similar. There are some cultures where women do prefer much older men or men who are almost exactly the same age as themselves.
Yeah.
But, around a few years older is the average preference of women. And most women hold this preference throughout their lives. That preference is stricter in their early 20s. So a woman in her early 20s generally won't want to date a 19-year-old at any cost, right?
Right.
But a 33-year-old woman will be very open to dating a 29-year-old man in general. So that preference becomes less strict.
Okay,
as
the 2 to 4 year.
Yeah, about that.
Okay.
And it seems, there's a question of like who holds more power in the mating market. And one indicator that women seem to have more power is that on this very measurable trait, it's women who get what they want, right? So men say, I want to date someone a couple years younger to, let's say when they're older, 10 years younger, when they're in their 40s, let's say.
Yeah.
That's not what most relationships do. It seems that women must hold the cards here to some extent because the average age gap is around 2 to 4 years, right? The average relationship age gap.
So women are getting our way.
Yeah, so women are getting their way. That's exactly right. So women are getting what they want in terms of age gaps, and some, but not all men are getting what they want as well. And another note that I'll say about men's age preferences is that a lot of people seem to think that men want younger women for, and I understand where this is coming from. And for some men, this probably is the case.
Yeah.
That men want younger women due to like the ability to control them or things like that.
Oh, okay.
That's what some people say.
Yeah.
But the evidence for that is slightly weak, just because if you look at men in their very early 20s and late teens, they actually prefer older women.
Yeah.
So it seems that there's a peak age in terms of looks that men converge on. And that age is, loosely correspondent to peak fertility. So there might be an evolutionary explanation there. But again, this is a finding that I've spoken to women who are really depressed by this finding and really don't like it, right?
Yeah.
Because it is quite upsetting. But if you think about it, that's just in terms of looks. If you look at what men actually do, it's not like all men in the world are competing for very young women.
Right.
That might be where the competition, quote unquote, peaks. But a man in his late 30s generally is not going to be interested in someone quite that young.
Yeah. And even tangentially, as a matchmaker, most men aren't looking to date. Like if they're in their mid 30s, they're not trying to date 22-year-olds.
Yeah. Very few men.
Yeah.
Very few men actually want that in practice.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, like I'm only 27 and that seems pretty young to me.
Yeah.
Like that's that's a 5-year age gap. I can't imagine, 5-10 years from now speaking to a 22-year-old and thinking, oh, this would be a good life partner for me.
Right.
So I think the only men who would be interested in that sort of age gap would be men who really do just put physical attractiveness above everything else.
Yeah.
Or in some cases have the sort of psychology where they want someone who's easier to control, easier to manipulate. I do think in some cases that's going on. I just don't think it's the best explanation for the overall phenomenon, especially since we see it cross-culturally.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. Okay. And then as women get older, though, do they prefer younger men?
They're increasing. I wouldn't say that they prefer younger men.
Okay.
But they become increasingly open to dating younger men.
A younger man.
And then also, if you graphed women's ratings of physical attractiveness the same way that you did with men, it would look like, thinking men around their own age are most attractive. Until about 30, and then it's slightly younger, are the most physically attractive. And then by 40, women are consistently saying, the most physically attractive men are younger than me.
Okay.
Which I think, looking around the world, looking at male heartthrobs in media, looking at men featured in women's magazines, some of those men are, in their 40s and 50s. But for the most part, it's men in their 20s and 30s that women are really interested in from a physical attractiveness, look at how good looking he is perspective.
Totally.
And so that's going to factor into things when you look at women as they get older. There's more of a trade-off. Also, as women get older, they're more established in their careers. They don't necessarily, because the main theoretical argument for why women prefer older men is because older men have more money and more status and more maturity, right?
Yep.
By the time you're 40, the maturity thing's not really a factor. The money thing's gonna be less of a factor. Like most men are around, or many men have already got a lot of earnings at that point. And so, if you're a 22-year-old woman dating a 20-year-old man can sound totally unappealing. But if you're a 40-year-old woman is a 38-year-old man, is that really a big deal? Probably not.
Yeah. Nope. This is interesting. Okay. Do you think it's important for both men and women as they're dating to try to make themselves look younger from an appearance standpoint?
I would say that for everyone except young men, that is 100% true. Yes. So youth and beauty after a certain age, after, let's say after 25 I'm kind of pulling out a number there, but at some point in the mid-20s, after that, youth and beauty are basically synonyms. I mean, like, maybe if you're a younger man doing some kind of efforts to look older, such as growing a beard or something like that, maybe that could be favorable. But for the most part, having a better hairline. I mean, as a woman, I feel like women already know this and are already very tuned into this. Like, oh, looking younger is generally better, at least past the mid-20s. But for men, I think it's more ambiguous to a lot of them. But I would say personally, as someone who's been studying physical attractiveness for years, I'm very interested in this topic. You want to, at least put on some retinol, right? Maybe consider some minor cosmetic procedures if necessary, and definitely get on top of your hairline. So a lot of men, let the hairline recede past a certain point, and then they can't get it back. And unfortunately, that has a really dramatic impact on women's perceptions of your attractiveness. So I would say that for the most part,
losing your hair.
Yeah, I wish it weren't this way, but because it is something painful that a lot of men have to deal with, but women do discriminate quite harshly against bald men on the dating market.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's kind of a funny one because if you look at studies of men with shaved heads, studies of bald men, they're often perceived as more dominant, as more masculine, as more aggressive, as more competent, even as taller. There was one study where they animated the men, they edited the men such that their hair was taken off.
Okay.
And those men were perceived as about an inch taller.
Oh.
Right? Just from having no hair on their heads, because they look so much more manly that you think, oh, men are big, they're probably quite tall.
Yeah.
So you'd think from kind of a completely abstract perspective, like, oh, this is a pretty masculine trait. It's a signal that you're a fully mature man to have a receding hairline.
Yeah.
Women should theoretically like this. And then you actually do the studies, and women really, there are some women who like it, but for the most part, women really don't like receding hairlines, and they really don't like baldness.
Yeah.
So it's, if you're a man and you're starting to experience some recession, I don't want to panic anybody. It's certainly not the worst thing in the world to lose some of your looks, but minoxidil, finasteride, derma rolling has some evidence as well.
Okay. Hair transplants?
Hair transplants after a certain age can be worth it, but you don't want to do them too early, because then, I mean, you see this with men who get transplants done early, that sometimes they end up with like really thin, because the transplant works, but then a lot of the transplanted hair is rejected, and they end up with like a forward hairline that's like very thin. So you want to, I would say, don't talk to me, talk to a dermatologist, right?
Yeah.
But if you're a man and you're experiencing some hair loss, be loosely aware that your options are, as you say, transplants, minoxidil, finasteride, maybe some more experimental stuff like derma rolling. And it would be worthwhile to at least meet with a dermatologist once and create a plan and stick to it, especially if you haven't met somebody yet, because it will have a negative externalities for your mate value.
Yeah, even if you make a lot of money.
I mean, money solves a lot of problems, but it's certainly not ideal to have. I would say that when you're dating, when you're single, you shouldn't give up any advantage that you could have over potential, mating competitors. Yeah. I mean, in stated preferences, pen and paper surveys. I'm not saying anyone's lying, by the way, but in pen and paper surveys, generally, women will say that they don't care that much about looks, right? And they'll say that they care quite a bit about money. Yeah. But in practice, right, in speed dating, on dating apps, at least initially, I'm not saying through the whole relationships, but at least initially, looks is probably the most important thing for getting your foot in the door. Yeah, based on the data that I've seen. So if you're a man, you don't want to be in a position where, you've got incredibly thin hair or incredibly bad skin or whatever, and you're introducing yourself to women and having to slip into the conversation that, you've got a Bentley or something just so they turn their nose up at you. I would say, it's not a disaster. Some women, again, do prefer a bald man, but I would say it's foolish to give up any advantage that you have. And the earlier you get involved with, stopping recession, it's going to be to your advantage. Yep.
I love that. When it comes to beauty, do people want a completely symmetrical face?
So this is a really interesting question. So normally when I go on a podcast and talk about symmetry, I'll just say, symmetry is attractive, right? Because
generally it is. Yeah.
But one interesting tidbit is that if you in the lab artificially create perfectly symmetrical faces, people actually rate them as less attractive than slightly asymmetrical faces.
Okay.
And you might think, why would this be? Well, one idea is that humans have this psychological phenomenon called the uncanny valley. It was originally applied to robotics, but the idea is that if something looks almost but not quite human, we find it very creepy. It's very unsettling.
Yep.
If something looks not that human at all, like a teddy bear, for example, right, where it's got kind of the face shape of a human, but it's a bear, you don't find that creepy.
It's cute.
Right? It's cute.
Yep.
And if something looks perfectly like a human, think about like the new AI videos, right? Actually, this is a really good example to explain this. The newer AI fake images, they look really nice. People don't mind them. But even a year ago, a lot of the faces that were generated, they had this slightly uncanny quality. Even though they looked almost perfect, they were quite disturbing. This seems to happen with symmetry as well. Because in nature, perfectly symmetrical faces basically never occur. When we see one, it registers as, let's say, a human, right? It's not quite there in human.
Yep.
So I think that a lot of people, you can take comfort in this. A lot of people look at their own facial asymmetries and they think, oh, this is, a disaster for my looks. But if you look at the most attractive celebrities, right? Male celebrities like Jacob Elordi, Tom Cruise, both of these guys actually have quite notable asymmetries. If you look at a photo, if you look at a photo of their face and actually concentrate, you'll notice that there are lots of asymmetries there. It doesn't really have a negative impact on their looks.
No.
So I would say that unless you've got glaring asymmetry, it's really not something to worry about. Symmetry isn't the sort of trait where it's kind of like height, where it's like, yes, taller men have an advantage, but you don't want to be like 6'9", like that's not ideal, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of, symmetry is kind of like that. No,
like
no
if you
hate
go too far.
But yeah, right. It's like if you go too far on symmetry, the advantages decrease, and then eventually it actually is worse.
There's a sweet spot.
Yeah.
Okay. So are there any actresses you can think of who have asymmetrical faces but are still really beautiful?
Ooh, that's a good question.
Because is it more important for women than it is for men?
Well, I wouldn't say it's necessarily more important for either, but I would say that if you looked at any individual actress closely enough, you would notice that she had many asymmetrical features. Like I would say, look up photos of the most famous actresses smiling, and you'll notice that very few of them have a perfectly symmetrical smile.
Yeah,
it's usually off to one side. If you were to focus on their eye area, it's very rare that they'll be at the exact same height, exact same shape, exact same scleral show, that sort of thing, exact same upper eyelid hooding. Right, there's always going to be some variance there, and they're still very beautiful. I really wouldn't stress it.
It's almost like you need to zoom out. Like if you're somebody who picks apart your looks, but you're looking this closely. It's like zoom out a little bit. You actually want the asymmetry. Okay, we're going to say something else.
Well, I'm just kind of thinking about it. It's funny. A lot of people think that they're very asymmetrical because of a phenomenon created by technology where you use the front camera and sometimes it automatically flips on some applications and things like that.
Oh, that's happened to me a ton.
It's like, exactly. Yeah, people look at that and they're like, what the fuck? There's no way that I'm like this. And they think incorrectly, oh, this is how other people see me, but that's not accurate. People are going to see you the other way because that's what they're used to. It's like the drama of seeing all of your facial features that are asymmetrical move from one side of the face to the other when you're so used to it. And there's actually a test you can do to show if this is something that bothers you. There's a very simple test you can do to show yourself that this is an illusion.
Okay.
Next time you're, let's say, with your partner in the bathroom or something, or with a friend in a bathroom, someone who you know really well, you've seen their face many times, you're used to their face, look at their face in the mirror. And their face will also look slightly weird. It'll be like, oh, that doesn't really look like them.
That's
so
interesting.
If you're familiar enough with someone, you'll see that this is something that happens to everyone, and it's not really an accurate sign that your face is highly asymmetrical necessarily. I would say that odds are, if you've got an actual noticeable asymmetry, someone will have commented on it at some point.
Yeah.
Someone will have been like, oh, your nose is crooked.
Yes.
You would have heard about it in grade school. So if you've sailed through without people noting that you're asymmetrical, I would say you're probably
You're
more than
good.
enough. Yeah.
And you don't need to be perfect to find a mate.
Yeah, not at all. Again, like there are some actors and actresses who are considered very beautiful who would be also measurably asymmetrical.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good to know. So statistically speaking, I'm now dating a pretty boy. So I want to know the science behind this. Is it better to be a pretty boy, or is it better to be a more masculine looking face?
Well, that's funny. Yeah, no, I remember it just incidentally, my mom saw a photo of the guy you were dating because I was showing her your like matchmaking business and he popped up and like, oh, that's her boyfriend. And she's like, oh my God, he looks like Ryan Gosling. And I'm like, yeah, he's like a darker Ryan Gosling.
He's a pretty boy, yeah.
Face shape. So facial femininity, it's interesting. So most men want to look as masculine as possible.
Okay.
Right. They want facial masculinity. They think to themselves, they see a photo of like Jocko Willink or someone like that, or, a very handsome guy like Henry Cavill, and they think, oh, that's how I want to look. I love the masculine look. And there are very many men who have very masculine faces who are physically attractive. Henry Cavill is a good example.
Okay.
But if you look at heartthrobs in women's media, right? The men who women are really obsessing over. Some of them are very manly. Jason Momoa would be a good example of like a very manly face. But I would say that maybe even a slight majority of them are quite feminine presenting in their facial structure.
Yes.
A lot of people don't understand what facial masculinity is.
Isn't it a big jawline? Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, so I'm so glad you said that. So that's something that a lot of people associate with facial masculinity, and a wide jaw is certainly part of facial masculinity, but a sharp jawline is not, right? So like if you look at someone like Angelina Jolie or many other actresses as well, they'll often have sharp jawlines and it doesn't masculinize their face, right?
Not at all.
So but for whatever reason, when looking at men, people think, oh, he has a sharp jawline, he looks very manly. Really, he just looks quite attractive. So facial masculinity would be traits like smaller eyes, closer together eyes, thicker eyebrows, less arch in the eyebrows, so more kind of flat eyebrow versus arched, thinner lips, larger nose, higher facial width through the center of the face. These are the sorts of things that we're actually talking about when we talk about facial masculinity as a construct, right?
Yep.
And there are some studies that indicate that women prefer slight facial masculinity and that extreme facial masculinity is unattractive. Because, a very masculine face would just look pretty scary, right? It wouldn't look very aesthetic unless you have really great other traits like Henry Cavill does. I've mentioned him a few times.
Yeah.
But there are other studies that indicate that women may prefer, like Perret et al.'s study, that women may prefer even slightly feminine faces. So again, pretty boys, right? And what I would say is that based on my reading of the literature, the ideal for a man is to have a moderate amount of, facial masculinity, facial femininity. You don't want to look too manly, right? Such that you look scary.
Yeah.
You also don't want to look so womanly that you're like accidentally getting identified as a woman, right? That also wouldn't be good.
Yeah, I've noticed some actors in Hollywood getting lip filler.
Yeah.
And I'm like, don't do that.
And it feminizes their face too much. Again, and it's good that you picked up on that because that is a trait that's associated with facial femininity, larger lips.
Yeah.
Right? It doesn't necessarily work. You don't want to go too far in either direction. On bodies, it's different.
Okay.
So bodily masculinity is a very strong predictor of women's attraction to men. I'm not saying, oh, you don't want to look so manly because I have some kind of agenda. I really don't. I've just read that literature and said that looking manly from a facial perspective isn't that great. From a bodily perspective, it's definitely all it's cracked up to be. So having broader shoulders, narrower hips, bigger muscles, these are things that at least up to a point, again, are responded to very positively by women. And this should be intuitive. Like as a man, you wouldn't want to have like a tiny waist and wide hips and tiny shoulders.
And
right?
long legs.
Yeah, and long legs. Yeah, that's another example. Men do have longer torsos relative to their legs on average. And that's one question that I have about the leg lengthening surgeries is that, I mean, I hate even saying this because they've been through so much to get those long legs, and maybe I'm negging them a little bit because I'm quite tall and I don't want height inflation to be a thing.
Yeah.
But objectively, having longer legs relative to your torso is a feminine look, and a lot of these guys, they finish the surgery, and they look quite compressed in their torso and have, these lovely long legs, right?
Yeah,
and it's a very womanly look. So it's not necessarily, I'm sure that the height adds to their attractiveness to some extent.
Yeah.
But some of what they're adding at least is being taken away from based on them feminizing their proportions.
Yeah. Is that common, the leg lengthening?
Thank God it's not.
Okay.
No, it's a very rare procedure. It's a very expensive procedure.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things where, look, as a man, there are things you can do to adjust your height, right? So let's say you're 5'6", right? As a man, if you were to get, a little more volume in the hair on top of your head, wear
Benny
boots.
Blanco.
Right. Yeah,
His hair is
exactly.
big.
Yeah. And he's quite short. And so you do that and you wear some boots that will have, an inch and a half comfortably, right? You could get shoes that have 2 inches and still look relatively normal. And then you stand with good posture. On paper, you're 5'6", but in the bar, you're like 5'10", right? And that's just not a deal breaker for most women. On a dating app, it might be a deal breaker, but in the real world, most women are not tall enough to care. As long as you're taller than them, it's not going to be a huge deal in most cases. So I would say that if you're, considering leg lengthening surgery, I'm not saying that no one's had a good experience with it, but from what I've seen, it's tremendous financial cost, tremendous physical disability and hardship. And many of the benefits that are obtained, the illusion of those benefits could be obtained to get your foot in the door. Again, most women are, the fact that the average man is 5'9" tells you that sexual selection on men's height has not been so severe that 5'9" is going to exclude you from the dating market.
Yep.
And a good portion of men under 5'9" can look 5'9" when they go to the bar if they want to.
Yeah. It's all about the shoes, the hair, all those different things. Like
good posture. And then also having, a confident atmosphere. I think adding a bit of muscle also helps quite a bit.
Yeah.
I mean, anecdotally, I know a lot of guys. I mean, I once, I know a lot of guys who have successfully compensated for their height to some degree by packing on the muscle.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the reason, and that makes sense, because a lot of the reason evolutionarily that height is attractive to women is because it signals formidability.
Okay.
But if you're, 6'5" and waif-like very, very svelte, very skinny,
like
versus
Timothée
someone
Chalamet, maybe.
although he's quite short, but that's that structure, the physical.
Wait, Timothée Chalamet's short?
I think he's like 5'9", yeah.
Oh, I thought he was tall. Okay, sorry, continue.
Oh, we've just broken so many womenens' hearts. Yeah,
I know.
They're listening like, what?
Skinny.
No.
Oh,
I think he's slightly below
interesting.
average and skinny, as far as I remember.
Okay.
Maybe he's 5'10". I'm not sure, but I know that he's not. For some reason, it's in my head that he is not tall.
Okay. But build the muscle is what you're saying.
So building a little bit of muscle can give you some of that formidability. I mean, especially if you're not even short. Like a lot of guys will say they're short when they're 5'9", and I'm like, oh, you're average. It's fine. Like
it's true.
You're taller. You're taller than like
78%
78% of women. Like what's the huge stress?
I've also noticed as women get older, they're a little bit more lenient with the height preference.
They're lenient. They're going to be more lenient on that as they get older, regardless, just because, as you get older, you become wiser about like what really matters. And we see that young women do put this huge priority on physical beauty in men. But as you get older, your priorities shift a little bit. And those tend to, I'm not saying that, older ladies don't care about, that, women in their 40s, 50s, 60s don't care about looks. I'm sure they do. But on paper, at least in surveys, they care much less than women in their 20s. 30s. Yeah.
I would agree. Can you talk to me a little bit about the raw trend on social media? What is that and what are the implications?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I've been seeing a lot of people comment raw on, and it's mostly women and some gay men as well.
Oh my God.
Who are posting, they're commenting raw under any handsome man on TikTok, right? And it got me thinking, because this reminds me of a study by Elefthero, where they surveyed women and they, had faces of varying physical attractiveness. And they asked them, how willing would you be to have sex with these men, right? Based on their appearance.
Yeah.
And they may have had some other biographical qualities as well. And physical appearance obviously had a huge predictive power in like who people were willing to have sex with. I mean, water is wet. But what was interesting was that they also found that the more attractive physically the man was, they found that the more physically attractive a man was, the more willing and interested a woman was in not using protection during intercourse.
Yeah.
So the raw trend, the fact that that joke is funny, suggests that many people have a folk psychological understanding of this connection between physical attractiveness and intent to use protection.
Yep.
And this trend doesn't just exist, even though it's women, and from what I've seen, it's mostly women commenting this. This trend also exists in men, where men are less interested in using protection when having sex with somebody if they're more physically attractive, right?
Why do you think that is?
Well, it's funny because I'm very much caricatured as a total Evo bro, and there is a real tempting evolutionary explanation where maybe at a gut level, at a deep psychological level, we intuitively know that getting someone pregnant or becoming pregnant by someone who's physically unattractive is not a good situation, right? You want to have attractive offspring.
Right.
That's a huge advantage for them. And so maybe at some intuitive level, we know that. And that would also fit with some of my research that shows that when people have affairs, when they cheat on their partner, they tend to prize physical attractiveness at a higher degree, right? Which I could explain. But despite that all lining up in a very neat story, I think that it's easier to just say that it's just a sensation thing, in the sense that they're more enthusiastic about the sexual interaction in general. I doubt that there's an evolutionary story, even though it's a fun one. I think it's more likely that people are just, super tuned in to how hot they are, and that's making them more willing to do anything.
Yeah, and I also feel like women hold better looking men to lower standards.
That's exactly right.
And I see that as a matchmaker
that's
all
exactly
day,
right.
every day.
And it's not something that women are unaware of either, because if you speak to women, they'll make jokes about like, oh, when he does X, Y, and Z, but he's 6'5", or, but he's a millionaire, da 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 da. There are all these memes that poke at this idea that if you have a trait such as good looks, such as wealth, that raises your mate value to a certain degree, well, then less rules are going to apply to you. And that definitely happens with looks, and it happens with women as well. I mean, the amount of men I've seen put up with absolutely horrific behavior because it was the best looking person they'd ever dated, it's just embarrassing. It's like,
it's crazy.
You have to be able to take a step back. But I understand that for a lot of people in the moment, looks have such a powerful effect. Another way that looks have a powerful effect, it's not just the looks themselves, but it warps our perception of someone's personality. So when someone's good looking, we think they're funnier than they are. We think they're kinder than they are, right? We think that their intentions are purer than they actually are. It's called the halo effect in psychology, the halo effect of physical attractiveness. And so if you're in a relationship with someone who's very beautiful or very handsome, you're going to bend over backwards to misinterpret and reinterpret their actions in such a way that it's favorable to them.
It's like the crazy hot scale.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right.
That's very funny. Do men prefer dating women with successful careers?
Some men certainly do. Some men certainly don't. In general, it's very interesting, because online and in general, you'll see that a lot of men say, I don't care about a woman's career. It doesn't matter to me at all.
They say that to me as a matchmaker too sometimes.
Yep. And in surveys, that's also true. So if you survey men and you say, do you care about a woman's career? They'll often say that they don't. But, there's something that a lot of people in the dating discourse say, which is that you should be less interested in what people say and more interested in what people do. And there are two pieces of information that are quite interesting here. One is that the more successful a man is, on average, the more successful his partner is, right?
Okay.
And that's in terms of income, in terms of when they meet. So men who are more successful tend to select in their dating. These men have more options than other men, and they tend to select other successful women. Most men who are educated, right? They tend to also select women who are educated. So there seems to be, at least, maybe that's just coming from the women's selection, them selecting up in terms of these traits. But I don't think so. I think that to some extent, men do care. I certainly care, right? Like I can't imagine, dating someone who I felt was not at least doing something that I found admirable with their life and their career or their education or something like that. They don't need to have tons of money or anything, but something that I can admire. But some men say that they don't care, and it's hard to know how seriously to take them, because one thing we see is that in stated versus revealed preferences, men will say that they don't care, but then if you look at how traits actually predict their romantic evaluations, they're much more influenced by a woman's success than they say. Okay. So in the same studies that show that women care more about looks than they say, also generally show that men care more about money and status than they say when dating.
Oh, interesting.
So
okay.
A man might say to you as a matchmaker, he might say, oh, I don't really care about, let's say he's a very successful man. He might say, oh, I don't really care about her career. She can do whatever. She could be a waitress, blah, 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 blah.
As long as she's passionate is the line I get.
Yeah, that kind of thing. But then he actually goes on a date with the waitress, and if he's, a CEO or something, or he's, a very high-powered lawyer, he might be on that date thinking, fuck, I've got nothing to talk about with this lady, right?
Yep.
And he might also, to some extent, especially if he's from, that higher upper echelon of status, he might find himself looking down on her in some ways. And so I would say that men tend to underestimate how much this actually matters. And that's proven by the fact that most men who are educated date women who are educated. Most men who are successful date women who are successful. And most men, when they're actually making romantic evaluations and speed dating studies, or even in their relationships, they care about this much more than they say in a pen and paper survey or in a TikTok comment.
That's really interesting. Do you also think it's because of proximity?
Oh, yes.
Like if you're successful, you're probably going to be around other successful people because you went to college together and you're going in different circles that are similar. Yeah,
I'm so glad you said that, because one piece of dating advice that I see a lot of people online give, and sometimes these people have good intentions, sometimes they don't. But they'll say, oh, if you're a woman, you've got limited years, right, to find someone. And so you should apportion your time such that you focus on finding a mate versus building a career.
Yep.
Now, this is debatable advice on its face, right? Because, if you don't find a mate, if that goes poorly, then you've got no mate and no career. But if you go for the go for the career, you can at least support yourself throughout your life should that not work out. However, on the other end, women generally, on average, don't want to date just anybody. And if the reality is, and this is the reality, by the way, from an empirical perspective, if the reality is that richer women tend to end up with richer husbands, and if the reality is that more educated women tend to end up with more educated husbands, and you're a young woman and you want to date a man who's educated and has money, right? You want to date a high status man. Well, the only way to access those men is to get around them. And the only realistic way to put yourself around them is to get educated and get some money. And that's just a proximity perspective.
Right.
Never mind that a lot of those men who are in those positions, they might say that they would date down freely, but in practice, they're going to have a lot of difficulty with the cultural mismatch. And also with, again, as we spoke about earlier, they're on the date and they think it's fine because she's very beautiful and passionate or whatever. And then they start talking and they realize she doesn't understand their lifestyle, their background whatsoever. And there's a total mismatch. And that's why we see that people mate quite assortively on those traits, proximity and shared interests. So if you're a young woman, it's not exactly clear to me that focusing on your career does disrupt focusing on your mate acquisition efforts, because the better your career is, the better mates you're going to have access to, at least empirically.
Yeah, and so maybe it's worth waiting a few years and not just settling down with the first guy.
Yeah, and getting your money up, getting in a position where you can support yourself and also have enough experience and interests and exposure that you can actually end up with a man of the caliber that you actually desire.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of this advice kind of hinges on like, oh, you want to get married, so you should just marry anybody. But a lot of women don't think like that. A lot of women really do want Mr. Perfect. Yeah. And it's hard to access that guy if you're not going to put yourself in proximity to those sorts of men.
Yeah, I agree. Why are successful women immune to the decline of marriage? I'm very curious about this.
Yeah, well, this is something that I asked on Twitter, and this is something that maybe people in the comments of this podcast can help us think through. Marriage has been declining since the 1970s, let's say. And it's been declining primarily for the bottom 70% of women from an income perspective. This is premarital income. Those women are about, let's say about 15% less married than they were at that time.
Okay.
The top 10% of women they have not experienced this decline. They are as married as ever. And the top 1% of women actually seem to be more married than ever.
And you're saying this from a socioeconomic status standpoint?
From a premarital income perspective.
Okay.
So women who are financially successful are not experiencing this divorce recession that other women are and other people are going through. Or this marriage recession.
Yep.
So it's a question of why are women who have high incomes not experiencing the same decline in marriage? And it's hard to know. One thought that I have is that if you look at men's pen and paper preferences, their stated preferences, men care more about a woman's income and a woman's financial prospects than they did at that time.
Yep.
So it could be that back in the day, women with high incomes were discriminated against on the dating market, but now they're actually viewed as desirable, right? It is useful if you're a normal person in 2025, it's useful to be dating a woman who can pay half the rent, right? So a lot of men are going to find it more appealing than they once did, and that might explain why those women are more married than they once were. It could also be potentially that, and this is kind of a hard point to explain, but it could be that for the bottom 70% of women back at that time, they didn't have the option to leave, but now they do. And so they're leaving at higher rates, whereas that top 10% always had the option to leave, right?
Yeah.
And so they're not experiencing the same decline. And then maybe for unrelated reasons, they're experiencing a boost, such as what I mentioned earlier with men being more interested in a woman's salary and in her income. Do you have any thoughts on it? Because it's kind of a tricky one.
Yeah, I think it might be related to the achievement gap where, men are, achieving college degrees at a much lower rate now and women are doing it at a higher rate. And so I think that, a lot of people do depend on a 2-income household.
Yep.
And so when a man is looking for a partner, he's truly looking for a partner. He's not just looking for somebody to manage the household, but probably bring some income in. That's my theory.
And I think it's a good theory. I mean, look, I'm not exactly struggling, but I don't feel like I'm in a financial position where marrying someone who doesn't make money would be an option for me. Just being frank. It's like, okay, it's not that I couldn't provide for someone else. It's more just that if I did, that would mean, okay, so we're never buying a house, right? The kids can't go to college in America, right? Like it's a bit of a disaster for average dudes of average means. Not having a woman with an income is a bit of a disaster. So I think you're probably bang on there.
Without parents who are supporting you or subsidizing you. Yeah. 1,000%.
And then we're also seeing with this this achievement gap that you spoke of, that women are dating down at a higher rate than ever. They're also it seems like assortative mating or homogamy is on the decline, but you'll see a lot of comments online that women are hypergamous. Maybe you've seen this. Yeah, and it means that women, what they're trying to say. And now I'm going to mansplain it, but I'm actually saying it just in case anyone. I know.
No, I like when you explain things. Not everyone knows these.
Yeah, exactly. I'm going to mansplain hypergamy, but no. So hypergamy basically just means like dating up. In a academic context, it's usually about education and sometimes about socioeconomic status. And there are some people online who basically stretch the definition and rework the definition so it can mean anything they want at any time, right? When a woman dates up in looks, it's hypergamy. When a woman dates up in status, it's hypergamy. Blah 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 blah. Not realizing that if you set it up that way such that when a woman dates up in looks and down in money, it's hypergamy. And if a woman dates up in money and down in looks, it's hypergamy. Well, then it's hypergamy from the other side as well. And the word becomes meaningless. However, hypergamy does not seem to be on the decline per se, but hypogamy is definitely on the rise. So women are dating down at extraordinary rates. It's in most of Europe and in America, this is becoming the new normal, is that women are on average more educated than men. And so on average, these new marriages that are forming, they're usually married down, at least in terms of education. And, we can debate whether education is a good proxy for status, but I'd say it's pretty close.
Or even income.
Yeah, in terms of measurable things, It is difficult. I would like there to be more research on income because that's what I'd be more interested in.
Because there's a lot of blue collar workers who make
a lot of
way
money.
more than college educated people.
Yeah.
And they don't have student loans.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. The average plumber is going to make a lot more than someone with like a gender studies degree or something, or like a history degree, or someone who doesn't go to graduate school but has one of these, liberal arts degrees that doesn't actually lead to, let's say, commercially valuable skills on the market. I'm not saying that it's not worth studying those things, just that if your goal was to get rich, boy, did you make a mistake choosing a degree. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's all very interesting. And I think it's also case by case. Like whenever people are like, the answer to your problems are to date down, I think it's like a little too blanketed.
Yep.
And so if it's really important that you find somebody who's a high earner with a certain degree, then improve your looks and be in proximity to those people. And chances are you can get into a relationship with someone with those attributes. So I'm not somebody who ever gives blanket advice. Obviously, I'm a matchmaker, so I work one-on-one with people. For you, you're probably giving more blanket advice
like
as a
very,
researcher.
Aiming for the average person, and nobody's the average person, no individual.
Right.
So as a matchmaker, how often do you actually see, how long have you been matchmaking out of curiosity?
2 years.
2 years. Okay. So not a long enough time span to like see market level changes, but how frequent is it? Do you get to the end of a matchmaking process and see that a woman goes off with a man who's, let's say overall, considering education, job, occupational prestige and money, just gisty, like how often do you see people actually date down?
A lot.
Women.
A lot.
Yeah.
In New York City, a lot. There's a lot of very successful women here. And even if the man is successful in a certain regard, we do represent a lot of women who they're looking for a true partner and they're making $500,000 to $1 million a year and they're okay with a partner who makes between 150 to whatever. So, but like when you're talking about dating down, it's like, is that really a big enough gap to count it as dating down?
Yeah, because there's a clear, still, like 95th percentile. Yeah,
exactly. But she's the clear breadwinner.
Would you say that usually your matches are, from the woman's perspective, hypergamous or hypogamous?
The matches are more, a lot of times they're on like a very similar level, but it's still hypergamous to an extent.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. Especially, it just depends on who the woman is.
Yeah.
It depends on her age. It depends on her looks. It depends on many factors and what's attainable. But yeah, we've had clients where they've only dated people who were non-college educated and that didn't work for them. And so now their requisite is just somebody who has a degree, but that's a lot of people in the city. Yeah.
So, I mean, a lot of people will learn that by experience. Like we were talking about earlier, like these guys who say that they don't care about a woman's career, they don't care about a woman's education.
Yeah.
Or women who say that as well. It's like you think you don't care about those things until you try it out and realize, oh, that actually does matter to me in practice. And maybe you try it out and realize it doesn't. I think that happens quite commonly as well, is that we have certain expectations for a partner and then we realize we actually don't need those.
There are certain things that you don't need, and then there are certain things that you definitely do need.
Yeah, that you didn't realize. Yeah.
I think everyone should have like 5 main things that they're looking for, that they're not willing to compromise on. But then outside of those main things, and that includes family oriented, that includes somebody who wants kids and marriage, like the core things. And then outside of that, it's like you kind of have to be mentally flexible, is what I like to say.
Yeah. Interesting. I'm trying to think what my 5 would be. I've already got someone, but
I know. What are yours?
Fun to think about it.
We'll end with this and then I'll ask you where people can find you.
5 things? Oh my gosh. 5 feels like too many.
I know.
Well, I would say,
this is good to hear from a man's perspective from my audience, to be honest.
Yeah. I think that most people say that they don't care about looks. I know this from surveys and things like that a lot of people are very reticent. I'm someone who researches physical attractiveness, so I'm not going to be...
all you do.
Yeah, right, exactly. I'm not going to be shy about it. I would say that in my head and in my heart, I feel like, looks don't matter. No matter how they looked, it wouldn't matter to me. But in practice, it's like I've only ever dated people who I was physically attracted to. So I would say that that's clearly on the 5, even if I don't want to admit it, right? I would say that education is definitely important in the sense that, and this is just from my individual perspective, this isn't going to represent all men, but for me, like I've gone to school for so many years that like I just have very bookish interests. And so the things that I like to talk about, a lot of them are just very academic in nature. And so even if someone is to some degree self-educated, they just need to be intellectually curious enough about those subjects that they have information to bring to the conversation and we can chit chat in that way.
Yeah.
I would say that because of just my life position, it's not like academics aren't known for their Ferraris, right? So just like practically, I wouldn't be able to have like a stay-at-home partner or something like that. That's just not realistic. So someone who has their own ambitions, their own goals. And I personally find that very attractive if someone's, doing their own thing and is successful. And I'm trying to think of 2 more. I've been stalling. I think we'll leave it at 3.
Wait, so what are they? Ambition,
let's say,
education,
let's say
/ intelligence, and then
I would say that there needs to be there needs to be mutual physical attractiveness. I don't think that a romantic relationship can function without that. And I'm not going to be coy about that because it's the topic that I research. I'm happy to be honest about that. And then I would say that some degree of education, some degree of ambition, but those are like the only like measurable things I can think of. Obviously, they need to be funny and kind, and we need to share a sense of humor. We need to share, general tastes and general values. Those are very important, but those are so difficult to measure that I feel kind of weird putting them on the list. But I guess if we're doing 5, number 1 would be like good values. Number 2 would probably be like mutual physical attraction. After that, probably good banter. We can chat to each other, and part of that is going to roll into the education. And then let's say 5th, but still, unfortunately, just indispensable that they need to have something going on in their life. Yeah. And again, I've already got a partner. If anyone's thinking I fit that list at home,
just back off. He doesn't want you.
But she definitely ticks all those boxes.
He's very monogamous over here. No, I love it. I love that you listed it off. And to be honest, not to make you like general or oversimplify you, but what you just listed is what I hear from every single man. And they do always start with the physical attraction. And
really? I thought they'd be shy about that. I was thinking, I'm being so bold here. I'm going to be honest.
No, you're like, I'm doing something. No. Most men are like, they do need to, be physically attracted. You need to be their wtype. That's important.
Well, this is what's interesting is that women, sorry to interrupt you, but in research, women often say the same thing, like, I don't actually care about looks. But then in the actual, like hardcore study design, speed dating, romantic evaluations, that sort of thing, women care just as much as men. They're just less likely to say it.
Everyone cares, and that's why it's important. If you take anything from this podcast, invest in putting yourself together.
It's probably the biggest returns you can have if you're looking for somebody.
Amazing. Well, where can people find you?
I would say, if you're interested in my work, I'm on all social media. So Google away. It's everyone knows how to use their phones. Just Google my name.
Macken Murphy. Amazing. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you for inviting me again. This is I don't think there's any podcast I've been on 3 times. So this is
open door policy. You're always welcome.
Every time I'm in New York. I
love it. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.